In the last video, we got a really good start on our first report. We added a few charts and a map visual, we showed how interactive it can be, and we've got some information around population density that we want to explore. It's time to talk about one of the most powerful features of Power BI, measures. Measures are a feature I want you to start using early and often. Measures are dynamically calculated fields in your report that can be used for counts, sums, averages, percentiles, ranking, running totals, year-to-date and year-over-year figures, and numerous other applications. You create measures using a language called DAX, which stands for Data Analysis Expressions. DAX formulas look very similar to Excel formulas. In fact, they have many of the same functions. But while Excel formulas work with cells in an Excel workbook, DAX formulas are optimized to work with the tables and columns in your Power BI data model. Not only does DAX give you many more potential ways to summarize and analyze your data, it's also insanely fast at calculations and very flexible. As we get further into the course, you'll realize that one of the biggest benefits of measures is that they are reusable within other measures. So let's talk about what we did in our previous video. We calculated our population area and population density by just dragging those numeric fields with the sigma symbols next to them from our data set into our charts. When we do that, we're creating something called an implicit measure. Implicit measures are easy and straightforward, but they are not the recommended way of calculating measures in Power BI. Instead, you want to create an explicit measure, which means learning a little bit of DAX. Remember, explicit measures are fast, reusable, can be calculated across multiple tables, and are far more flexible than implicit measures. As you work with more complex data models, you'll quickly realize the limitations of implicit measures and see why Power BI developers avoid them. So let's go back to our report, and you can follow along with me here. First, let's rename our original fields that we used to create our implicit measures. We'll rename population to pop, and area to area square kilometers, and population density to density. My goal is to create one measure named population and another named population density, but Power BI won't let us create two things, so I have to rename these columns first. Looking at the far right side of my Home tab, I can see two buttons saying New Measure and Quick Measure. The Quick Measure option guides you through creating measures. It actually writes the DAX for you. We'll use that approach later so you can test it out, but first let's start by clicking the New Measure button. After a moment, you'll notice a couple of things changed. First, directly below your ribbon, you'll see a formula bar has appeared. Second, if you look at your Fields pane, a new field has appeared called Measure, with a calculator symbol next to it. The calculator tells you that this is an explicit measure, which is what we want. So we click into the formula bar, and we'll write a very simple DAX formula. When you press Enter, our new measure will rename itself, and it's ready to be used in our report. Let's go ahead and create our area measure as well. Click New Measure again, and this time in our formula bar, we're going to write area is equal to the sum of countries, area square kilometer. Press Enter again. At this point, we have two new measures, population and area, and we need to create one more for population density. This time, let's use the Quick Measure feature. After you click on the Quick Measure button, a window will appear. On the right side, you can see all the fields in our data model, including our new explicit measures, and on the left is a drop-down menu with a list of calculations. This is not the full list of calculations in DAX, it's just some basics. Let's scroll to the bottom of the list and select Division. When we do that, Power BI gives us two areas or drop zones that we can drop fields into, one for the numerator side of our division equation and the other for the denominator. We're going to drag population into our numerator and area into our denominator. So we're dividing the total population by the area. Once we hit OK, the window goes away and a new measure is created named population divided by area. Power BI is trying to be helpful and giving us a plain English description of what we did, but the real term for what we did is calculating the population density. So I want to rename that measure. To rename it, I'm going to double click on the measure and then type in population density. All right. Since I have our measures selected, let's also take a look at the formula bar and notice how Power BI has written the DAX for us. Let's take a look at the calculations get returned by our new measure. To do it, let's do it with a table visualization, which is a very common and extremely useful tool for summarizing your data. First, let's delete our stacked bar chart by left-clicking on it and then hitting our trusty delete key. Now let's add a brand new table visual to our report page. And I'm going to add in country, population, area, and population density. Tables are great because you can sort them interactively by clicking on any of the column headers. And tables have more hidden features that we'll talk about in a later video. But for now, I just want to look at what our measures have given us. The numbers are formatted a little inconsistently, so let's fix that. I like how area has the thousands separated by commas, and I really want population to look that way too, so I'm going to go to my fields pane and click on population, and I'm going to look up my ribbon. In particular, what we want is this new Measure Tools tab, which only showed up when I selected a measure from our fields pane. On this tab, we've got the ability to change the data type for our columns, how they're formatted, grouped, and sorted, and even how they're summarized when we add them to visuals. All I want to do here is add commas to separate my thousands in these numbers. So I'm just going to click on this little comma icon, and presto, my population numbers now display commas. And you can do this trick with any field in your data set, including regular columns. Just click on country and you'll see a column tools tab on your ribbon. This can be really useful when you want to change how specific columns are represented in your report. Moving on, let's sort my table by population density in ascending order, and we notice, hey, our first row doesn't have a population density. Hopefully it's obvious why. The area of the U.S. minor outlying islands is 0 in our data set, and you can't divide by 0. When we originally divided these two numbers in Power Query, you probably didn't notice, but it actually returned a tiny error message for this row saying NaN, or not a number, which is Power Query's way of telling us you can't divide a number by 0. If we had used that implicit measure for our table here, it would actually mess up our results. This is an example of how explicit measures like we just created are almost always preferable to implicit measures, because there's no NaN here. I don't necessarily like how this space is blank though. I would rather it be a 0 so our population density is consistent, even for weird situations like this where we're dividing by 0. Fortunately, if we click on our population density measure and go back to our formula bar, we can tweak our formula just ever so slightly to make this happen. You'll remember that the divide function takes two arguments in the quick measure window, the numerator and denominator. However, there's actually a third optional argument that the window doesn't display, and we're going to use it now in the formula bar. It's called alternate result, and it allows us to substitute a value whenever we're dividing by 0. What a great idea! One of the reasons I never use the Quick Measures button is because optional arguments are hidden, and in a case like this, you actually want to use the optional argument. So, from my formula bar, I'm just going to left-click just after my area measure, and I'm going to add a comma, space, and the words, DAX is awesome, and hit enter. Now, when we look at the U.S. minor outlying islands, the blank space has been replaced by the words, DAX is awesome. It's probably better if we just use a 0 though, so I'll modify my formula one more time to use a 0 instead of DAX is awesome. and now our table looks more consistent. Finally, let's do a little cleanup by replacing all the implicit measures we created earlier with our explicit measures. If we go to our tree map, we just need to replace pop with population. So we'll delete it and add our population measure to the values. And on the world map, we can replace density with population density. And notice how our charts look exactly the same, but we're no longer using those implicit measures. We're following best practices and laying the foundation for big success in Power BI. One last note, look again at my DAX formula for population density. I mentioned earlier how measures are reusable, and that's one of their biggest strengths. In this case, I wrote a single sum formula for area and another sum formula for population. Now, in our population density formula, instead of summing area and population again within the divide formula, I can just reference the names of those measures I already created. You can't do that with implicit measures. I've built data models in the past that have about 50 measures in them, and most of them reuse one or more measures that I already defined. That kept me from having to write the same formulas over and over again. With explicit measures, I only have to write those formulas one time, and then I can use them in other measures later on. Yet another example why DAX is so awesome, and you should always use explicit measures.